Okay, cool. What's up, guys? Welcome to the last lecture of the year, which is awesome. To some extent, because I was just reflecting. I wonder if you guys have learned anything over the course of this entire year. If not, well, it continues next year, right? But I think ultimately, you can't expect, I think wisdom, developing wisdom, and this is the point, right? Like you sit here, you hear lectures and stuff like that, and over time you accumulate knowledge, and as you reflect on the knowledge, you develop wisdom, okay? But wisdom isn't like instantaneous. I wouldn't even say that to some extent I have gained any wisdom. But I think the more that like I dig deeper into this subject, and it's starting to make sense to me, because I also have like a lot of questions about Buddhism in general, but the more that you read and analyze, it's like, oh, things start linking. And the issue is, I also recognize it was like, oh, like the topics to me, even at like whatever my level is of understanding, is like extremely difficult to grasp, right? And so, who knows? If you guys have picked up anything throughout the course of this past year, that's great, but if not, then I mean, there's plenty of time to continue asking questions, to continue to like listen to the lectures, and just finding time yourself to do the research, right? And then to figure out like, what is it that you guys do anyway? Like, what is it that you really believe in? Like, why show up to this temple every week? Why is the statue of the Buddha so important? Stuff like that. And so, that's just a general recap of like this entire year. And I looked through the book and was like, wow, we talked a lot about a lot of topics, but for me, I also had to like cycle back constantly to see like what's going on, like what is it, like what's the true essence of Buddhism, right? All right, and so last week, I realized it was really confusing because I was also confused on the topic, but I did ask for help, and then I also reread this section, and I started to really grasp like what it was even talking about. And like, so we were talking about like not having a soul, which is true. And actually I asked the monk himself, and he's like, it's not mentioned in Buddhist scripture about a soul, but consciousness is mentioned, right? And so we touched a little bit upon that. And so let me just like rewind and like speak to you guys about that very quickly. So ask yourself, what is life, right? And so that's what the Buddha did back then. He's like, what is life? And you realize that life consists of two things, right? There's the physical part, the matter, and then there's the mental part, right? The mind and everything that you perceive and stuff. And so when the Buddha looked at life, and he started analyzing life, he said, okay, there's actually only 5 forces that make up life, right? And he named those 5 forces. He said body, sensation, perception, thoughts, and consciousness, right? And he called it the 5 aggregates, okay? These are the 5 things that make up life. Notice, of those 5 things, there's nowhere in it does he ever mention there's a soul, okay? So that's one thing that's fascinating that you want to keep in the back of your head. And the idea is that like, first off, you can't have, life doesn't exist like between mind and matter. If you only have matter, life doesn't exist. And if you only have the mind without the physical matter, life doesn't exist, right? And so with this idea of the 5 aggregates, what the Buddha named as the things, the components that make up life, he also says that like I mentioned like last week, like the things that make up a fist, right? If you're missing one finger, you suddenly don't have a fist anymore. You have some other structure, right? And so if you go back, it's like you can't have life without the body, right? That doesn't make sense. You can't have life. But let's just say you do have a body, but you don't have any sensations that go along with the body. You can't see, you can't hear, you can't smell, but you have everything else. That still doesn't make sense. That's not really consistent of what life is. Can you have life of a body sensation, but like with no thoughts? Not really, right? And then also finally, can you have life without consciousness? Not really either, right? Let's just say there are people in like a vegetable state, right? Like they get into a car accident and they get a brain injury, and they don't have any consciousness. They're alive, right? They're on a breathing machine, and maybe they can sense things, but if they have no consciousness, are they really alive, right? So basically the Buddha said, okay, here are these 5 things that make up you, right? Y-O-U, right? These are the 5 things that make up you. What tends to happen, however, and this is like the big connection that I made, people confuse the 5 pieces that make up you. They begin to interpret that as a permanent thing, also known as your soul. And then from that, people construct stories about what happens to your soul, right? Particularly after death. And then hence the whole existence for heaven and hell, right? It's very interesting. And so, why does the Buddha disagree with this idea of a soul to begin with? Well, on the one hand, the Buddha says, nothing in this world is permanent. Everything is impermanent. But what is the soul? It's an entity, to some extent, as you guys know, that is permanent, right? And so that really clashes with like Buddhist thinking and Buddhist ideology, okay? And so, yeah, and the question becomes like, how can there be a soul that is permanent when the Buddha says everything in this world is impermanent? It makes no sense, right? And then, and so the conclusion is, it's like the people who, and this is where like the confusion that I was talking about lies. It's like, you think that because you have these 5 aggregates, because you feel that this is you think that you have a soul. But this is where the Buddha cautions and says like, actually, the idea of a soul, the idea of something permanent is not possible, okay? Because he says all conditioned things are impermanent. And so this is like the big connection that I began to see. And so it becomes this idea where the people who believe in the existence of a soul, it's very much like the analogy that I put in earlier, which is that it's so much like the rainbow, where you think it's like physical and real, but it's really, the creation of a rainbow is an illusion, right? It's not actually there. It's just a combination of the way that the light hits the water, the raindrops in the air, that creates the construction of a rainbow, right? And so this is the analogy of the people who tend to think, oh, because I have mind and matter, I have a soul, right? No, the existence of the soul is not true, actually. But then, if we don't have a soul, what is it that we have that carries on to the next life? And so the conclusion is your consciousness, right? The consciousness is the piece that once you have death, right? Your consciousness is the thing that carries on, but your consciousness is not your soul, because your consciousness, to some extent, is not permanent either. But let me just go back to the question of like, what is death, really quickly, and then it's really interesting to explore anyway, right? Because it's like an uncomfortable topic, but not really, because it's a natural process, right? Everything has to die eventually. But according to like the teaching, like what's death? And you think to yourself, what is death? It's when your bodily functions can no longer support your consciousness, okay? It's obviously all of our bodies get old, it decays. And so when your body gets too old and is decayed and it can't support your consciousness anymore, that's what they call death. Because there are some certain people who, even towards the end of their life, they are highly, very conscious. Even the Buddha, he died when he was 80, right? His brain was very conscious, but his body just couldn't support him any longer. And it makes sense, right? All things are impermanent. And so like, the more that you look into this, like, the truer the words become, right? And so, at the moment of death, what's happening, right? And so it's, they refer to it as 2 things, like about like, why is it that within the Buddhist tradition, there's no such thing as really like an eternal life in heaven or hell, right? Because what's happening at death? Like that's something that you guys should really explore. And to what extent does other religions, do they explore like the moment of death, like what's happening? So basically they say that at that very moment, your mental current, basically your consciousness, because it's driven to continue living on, that's 1, and then 2, because of karmic forces, like all the things that you've done in this lifetime, because of those 2 things, it basically, those 2 forces join up together and it springs into like a new physical body. And they call it, in the Buddhist tradition, they call it relinking consciousness, which is basically, at the moment of your death, right, your consciousness, A, and your karmic forces, these are the two things that actually follow you. They spring up in somewhere else, in some other body that's being born again, right? And so it's really fascinating. There's something really fascinating that there's this one statement that like I was really interested with. What comes first? Is it mind or is it matter? Think carefully here, because it's a really fascinating question in terms of life, right? What comes first? Is it mind or is it matter? And if you have matter, if you say matter, that's actually, well, I think, well, I mean, it digs into a deeper question, which is like, is there life in a fetus, right? And hence, like the whole like debate about abortion, and which is interesting because I really don't know how like what the Buddhist thoughts are with regards to abortion, but it's like if you have a fetus, right? Is there life in it? Is there consciousness in it yet? Right. So that's really interesting. But the idea is, where am I at? I was talking about like, how does the rebirth process work, right? And so, why is it that we are being reborn into another lifetime, into another lifetime, into another lifetime? It's those two things. It's like man's, or not man, but in general, the human desire to continue living after you're dying, and also a combination of like all the deeds that you've done, the karmic forces, leads you to being reborn into another lifetime, right? Okay? And the statement is that all beings are reborn as long as their good and bad karma remains in their conscious mind. It's in the form of mental energy. And I really find this fascinating because when you get to, and this is the part where I have like slight doubts, because when you study physics, there's a law, which is the conservation of matter and energy. Okay? And what does this law say? Matter can neither be created nor destroyed. And it's the same way with energy. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It just changes into different forms. So if you think about it, like everything that you know in this world, it just changes form. It doesn't get destroyed. For example, let's just say these flowers, right? Two things can happen to these flowers. They can either decompose, return to the earth, but they still matter, right? They don't disappear. Now, you could say, what if you burn them, right? What's happening? Well, if you burn these flowers, it's not like they're gone. They just change forms. And if you think about it, like the ashes stay, and then when you burn things, like there's a chemical reaction and then it releases gases and stuff like that. But all those things came from this flower, right? And so whatever this flower's original form was, it just transformed into a different form. And so what am I trying to get at? I'm trying to get at this, if the rule of physics, which is like the rule of the universe to some extent, is that matter can neither be created nor destroyed, and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. What is it that happens to us when we die? Because when we're alive, we have this certain energy about us, like a certain consciousness. So is it that like when we die, like nothing happens? Like this energy just goes away? But that kind of contradicts like the laws of the universe, right? And so that's really, really fascinating. The thing that I tend to question is it's like, what causes rebirth, okay? And so there is an explanation of what causes rebirth, and before we even go to the causes of rebirth, like what? So again, like I said, there's a lot of like webs that's really interesting, and they require like you to connect the dots. But I'm like weaving in and out of these dots, which is part of the issue of like the complexity of all of this, right? But hopefully, if you guys can follow along, that's great. If not, we'll just have to explain it a little bit better. But think back to why you guys are here. What's the goals of Buddhism, right? And it's really fascinating because the goal in itself is to, there's lots of goals, but one of them is to stop rebirth. Stop this cycle of rebirth, to escape samsara, which is the cycle of rebirth. Why is it that we want to escape samsara? What's wrong with being reborn again and again into different lifetimes? If you remember what the Buddha says, and it's not pessimistic, but all of life is suffering, right? This cycle of being born, getting old and dying is really to some extent the reality. I mean, it's true. Like, you can't say it's not true, right? And it's not being pessimistic, it's being realistic, right? It's like really looking at reality and seeing, okay, what's going on here? This is what actually life is about. And so the goal of Buddhism, and the goal of why you guys are here, is really, how can you get to this level where you escape the cycle of rebirth, right? And so what is it that causes rebirth to begin with? And here it says, ignorance. Ignorance produces desires, and these like unsatisfied desires, it's one of these energies that causes rebirth, right? And so people, to some extent, and our consciousness to some extent, become addicted to life. And so this forces, to some extent, like you to relink your consciousness into another physical matter or body to be reborn again. And so, how do you stop rebirth from happening? Well, you stop all the desires, right? And you stop ignorance. And so, yeah. And it says, when ignorance is destroyed, you understand the worthlessness of rebirths or the idea of eternal life. Yeah. But to some extent, I find it hard to, and this is the point where I grasp, it's like the selling point of escaping the cycle of rebirth. I don't know. It's all of life is suffering. That's why you must escape. That's like the conclusion. That's like the insight that like the Buddha has thought about. Okay, so that's the real idea. And he says like the way that you can escape is through wisdom, right? If you can dispel ignorance, you can stop this cycle from happening. And so he says, look, follow the Four Noble Truths, practice altruism and conduct, intelligence, and wisdom, right? Like, and altruism is just being like doing good deeds, okay? So that's basically the whole idea about the whole not having a soul, right? You still have consciousness, and the consciousness and your karma, these two things are the thing that it's the forces that bring you into the next lifetime, and the next lifetime, until you reach such a high level of study in Buddhism that you're able to really look at this and see, oh, this cycle is actually really meaningless. And I mean, it's up to you guys to decide, right? What is it that happens after death? And now you guys have three choices to think about. You could say choice number one, nothing happened after death. That's it, you just die. That's the end of it. It's just like a blank screen forever. That's choice number one. Choice number two is that you have eternal life in heaven or in hell. That's according to some religions. And then choice number three is your consciousness and your desire for more life brings you into another lifetime, and then another lifetime, and onward forever, right? So it's not black or white. It's either, nothing happens, something happens for eternity, or that you are being reborn until you stop this cycle. And this is what the Buddhist tradition is talking about. Like, can you stop this cycle? The last thing that I was going to talk about is, and because you guys know what karma is. Yeah, you guys know what karma is. I just wanted to go into like a little bit more detail about what it is. And I thought it was like, they gave a really fascinating analogy about karma that I just wanted to share with you guys, okay? So it says like the thing that brings us to the next life is your karma. It's one of the forces, right? Along with your consciousness. Karma is the thing that carries your consciousness to like another body for you to be reborn. So what is it, right? It's a force or form of energy that comes into being under certain conditions. Okay, that's very clear cut. And so it's energy. Karma is energy. And it comes into being, it comes into play. Well, it's energy and it's action too, right? It comes into play when certain things set it up for it. So basically it's like, the idea is like, if you plant a good seed and you do good deeds, you get good karma. If you do bad things, you get bad karma, right? And it's what I really like is it's like, where is it found? If it's an energy, where is it found, right? And why is karma such a big deal in the Buddhist tradition? And this is a couple of questions that like I want you guys to maybe think about and debate about, right, amongst yourself. Like, where is karma found? If it's this energy, like how can we verify that it's true? That's A. And where is it found? And I really like this analogy that says, like, mangoes are not stored in mango trees. Think about this. Or even any fruit that you want to think about, maybe an orange or like a banana. How do fruits come into being? Right? Fruits come into being like a tree. A tree doesn't have a mango ready. A tree doesn't have a banana ready. Things have to have happened for it to create these fruits, right? And so that's the same analogy, that's the same understanding of what karma is, right? When you put in certain types of actions, karma is created. It's really fascinating. And here's the second thing that really, like, it blew my mind in terms of analogy. It said wind and fire are not stored anywhere. Think about this. Where's wind? How does wind get created to begin with? Right? And if you guys don't know, it's like the difference between like even I don't. I understand how wind is created, but I can't really explain it. But it's basically like in terms of elevation, right? Like air is just sitting, and if there's a difference in pressure or elevation, the difference causes the air mass on this top to go down, right? And that creates wind. Right? But notice, wind does not exist by itself. Something has to have happened for it to start the process of creating wind. Just like fire. Fire doesn't just exist naturally. You had to have like strike a match to create fire. So that's a very close to the analogy of what karma is. Karma only comes into being based on what you do, right? Under certain conditions, right? So it's our choices, right? And it's us. Oh, and it's like the energy that reacts to our choices. And so our deeds, our words, our thoughts really produce our prosperities or our failures. And this is the same type of energy that brings us to the next lifetime, right? And so that's like the fascinating thing. I can talk more about karma, but I don't think it's necessary. I guess to some extent you guys know, hey. And I really like that the idea of karma is such a central piece within Buddhism, simply because it reinforces this idea that you should be doing good deeds, right? That you should have a lot of compassion for other people, and that you should be living by the Eightfold Path, which is having like right thoughts, right actions, right livelihood, right like concentration, right meditation, right views, etc. Like this is the reason why. And if you follow through with these the Eightfold Path, and you live like a Buddhist lifestyle, this is to some extent like the way in which you can develop wisdom, destroy ignorance, and ultimately escape samsara, which is the cycle of rebirth, right? And so, yeah, kind of able to connect all these pieces together. Do you guys have any questions? Questions? No? Everything makes sense? Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, we'll be back next year, right, to talk about this. I don't know. Do you guys have feedback? Like anything you guys would wish to talk about or hear? Or you're just gonna sit here and listen to the lectures all the time and then. I mean, there's no pressure. You guys don't have to answer or anything, but it's interesting. I think, again, the more that I have to read about this type of stuff, it's not the easiest thing to read, but it's also, it's worthwhile to investigate, right? I think it makes no sense to live like this entire life and not like look it deeply into like the spiritual side of life and like really start asking yourself questions. And the other thing I really like about like Buddhism is that like everything really connects. Like the idea of how like the idea of rebirth, like samsara, connects to karma, connects to this idea of not having a soul but having consciousness. Like everything in, or the idea that like everything is impermanent connects to everything else that the Buddha talks about, right? And so there isn't really like gaps in the teaching of the Buddha, which I find like, wow, this makes no sense at all. And so, I don't know. If you guys find like things, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, if you're not supposed to desire anything, don't people want to desire enlightenment?
That's a good question. That's a question that that they always ask. It's like, yeah, it's not necessarily desire ultimately though, right? It's following the process of living a good life, and if enlightenment comes, it comes. But the final words of the Buddha is that you have to work diligently for your own salvation, right? Otherwise, let me put I mean, it's a good question, but it's also like, what's the alternative, if not enlightenment? It's ignorance, right? So that's something that I've explored. I had a question myself, and I think the monk has answered it in that way. It's the idea that it's like, you don't work, you don't become a Buddhist and you don't do Buddhist studies just for the sake of desiring enlightenment, right? It's so that like if you live a good lifetime and if you put in the good deeds, the good karma and everything, you will achieve enlightenment on your own, right? By yourself, like through this path that the Buddha has laid out. It's not if you desire enlightenment and if you put in this practice, you will get enlightenment. That's not how it works, right? It's if you commit to the process itself is what takes you to enlightenment, not necessarily just simply your desires to get there. Because you can desire it all you want, but if you don't put in the work, you're not going to achieve it either. But that's a really good question that I've seen it before and I've explored it in my head, but I don't have like a concrete like answer to give you at this point, but I can flesh it out a little bit more and come back to that. But that's a good question actually. Anything else? Well, if not, then thank you for listening, and then we can continue next year.